Hey there. Today's original video was going to be a battle report, but unfortunately due to a very hectic week that didn't leave a lot of time for editing amongst other things, that's going to be pushed next week. But I did indeed make a video that at least half the community seems to hate and the other half of the community seems to love, and I made a tier list video, but not just any tier list video. This is a tier list of how easy or difficult it is to play the 18 different affiliations of Marvel Crisis Protocol, at least in my opinion. My name is Nate, and welcome to the Gamers Guild. All right, so I guess before we dive in, it's going to be helpful to know what some of the things I'm looking at when ranking these different affiliations, so that you can get an idea of what I mean without repeating myself over and over and over, because there are 18 different affiliations at this point. I will say I'm only going to be covering the affiliations and not the extra leaders in each affiliation. I'll kind of wrap it all into one bundle. And so as I explain through, you'll kind of see that happen, I guess. So first thing I'm going to be keeping in mind is how easy it is to understand what the team is capable of doing. How much do you have to know before being able to play that affiliation optimally or pretty well? How beginner friendly the affiliation is. So basically, how easy it is to pick up the game and learn it while playing this affiliation. How forgiving the team in question is. Are they durable? Do you have maybe some extra characters so that if one or two get out of position and dazed, you still have a chance to bounce back? And finally, how difficult it is to pilot that team at its best for it to just optimally shine. And so I'm just gonna start picking and choosing, I guess, and I'll start at the beginning. We've got A Force, and I think that they sit at A. They're a very straightforward affiliation. The leadership is not complicated as long as you can remember those triggers. It is absolute value town. Whenever one of your characters gets damaged, another one of your characters gets a free power. Only limit once per turn, but still, if like especially if throws or multi-damaging things start happening, yes, it's unfortunate that multiple characters are getting damaged, but on the plus side, you're getting bonus power for all that. So it's a core mechanic of the game that they're getting to benefit from. Things get a little and only a little bit complicated because you do need to time your bodyguards well. Because there are times like She-Hulk is a character ultimately you don't want too much damage on, because then she kind of gets like once you're at 7 health left, maybe even 10 health left, she could go down in a single activation of a strong attacking character. So you want to still utilize her bodyguard ability because it's very valuable. And sometimes you might even want a bodyguard for a bodyguard like a Koye, so that a Koye can then return the favor later with bodyguarding against a bigger attack. Knowing when to use special delivery, it's not always necessarily a turn one play that you're trying to pull off, and really just making sure you hold on to field dressing at save it at the right time, usually hopefully in the sense that you can get a good activation out of She-Hulk after she's been dazed, because the affiliation as a whole is filled with good characters that are really strong. But I think as a whole, you can pretty easily put this team on the table, go a little bit of attrition. They've got some control elements just kind of woven into everything else they're doing. All in all, pretty easy team to know how to play. And I guess keeping with that trend, next up is Asgard. And Asgard, I'm going to leave at C. This might seem a little bit weird because at first glance, they're a very attrition-y, just pound your face in team, which at a glance would look very simple to play. But when you kind of really start looking at this affiliation, uh, well, Enchantress has control, Thor has control, Valkyrie has control, Loki has control. Angela and Hela are the only two characters that don't actually have any control elements. So 4 out of 6 of the affiliation have control, and they're also very dice reliant, both on defense and offense. If you're not getting the wilds for Thor or whatever else you need on these characters' dice, they can just kind of suddenly start sputtering on offense and on defense. Thankfully, Thor's leadership does make up for that in the way of healing, and then you've got Odin's blessing. But timing those effects and that are really powerful effects, by the way, is going to be really key to for the duration of the game and the durability of the Asgard team as a whole. So being able to recognize that this is a team that can do attrition really well, but if the dice start failing you, you have a control element to lean back on. You just need to make sure that you're ready to lean back and know when that time to swap over is. So it can be a little bit more difficult to pilot ultimately. And they're because they're so dice reliant on defense, I don't think that they are a super forgiving team because you got high threat characters who like can be really durable if long as your dice treat you kindly. But that's something I try not to lean on too heavily, I guess, especially for a newer player, because dice will dice. And with that in mind, I'm gonna throw the Avengers, and those listening probably know I'm biased toward the Avengers. I'm still throwing them up at A. You can comment down below, I guess, if you strongly disagree. But hear me out first. And this is because I think both Steve and Sam, I'm kind of disregarding Tony's Hulkbuster affiliation leadership because it's not really one that you build around. You maybe bring that affiliation in against like a Magneto kind of team with a lot of throws, maybe even Asgard because they have a lot of throws. But as a whole, you're really looking to build with either Steve or Sam, and both of them are very straightforward. Sam's leadership, you'll know when one of your characters dazes or gets KO'd, and there's a trigger. It helps you heal. You go wide with Sam, so it's very forgiving in that aspect. And so as long as you're just putting out a bunch of the idea of Sam spam, a lot of 3-threat characters that are durable, you're just going to be at a really good point in the game. Kind of same thing with Steve. As long as you were building around that leadership of making sure you're able to benefit from superpowers being discounted both on your and your opponent's turn, it's just kind of value town. There's not too much else to have to go too deep into the tank to. Neither of these teams are super control oriented, but they both have control aspects to them so that you can get people off of objectives if you need to. And so with all that said, I think they're also pretty easy to pilot. They're a little bit forgiving because you've got some tanky characters in this affiliation anyway. I like the Avengers up at S tier for what they're doing. A team that is a little bit more complicated, and you may not necessarily think it at first glance, is Black Order. And really, Black Order could be anywhere from A to C, in my opinion, so I'm just going to leave them at B. The reason being because, yes, they are really easy to understand in the aspect of the attrition element of the game. They can go in there and they can absolutely wreck stuff. Corvus is probably well enough known that I don't have to get into too much detail, but his attacks can see successes on 7 out of 8 sides of the dice. He's deadly. It happens. So he's a concerning character. The double activation, trying to always keep Black Order priority is dangerous. But at the same time, Black Order's a team where you might only see 3 to 4 characters on the board at higher threat levels. And so they're not very forgiving. If Corvus gets caught out, it is very easy to just damage him down, whittle him down. He gets one last activation, and if he's not just killing everything, he's gonna die pretty easily in that following round too. Same thing with Thanos. He is pretty forgiving. They've got the invulnerability thing where they reduce damage by 1. But Thanos, if he's caught out and your opponent still has 3 activations left in you and you're done, Thanos could be in a really tough situation himself, and he's not quite as helpful on his injured side, in my opinion, because he loses the next thing I'm going to talk about, and that is the team being piloted at its best is quite a bit more difficult because while there's a very natural lean toward aggression here, There's a lot of control just on Thanos alone. Cosmic Portal is one of the few remaining effects that can control multiple enemy characters, and that plus the Mind Gem means you're able to move one character twice, which is extremely powerful. So having all of these things at your fingertips and only 3 models, it makes Black Order one of the more difficult lists to pilot at its best. But it's still pretty easily able to be picked up and just say, "Hey, go kill stuff and have fun." Black Order's probably one of the easier lists to point to at that, but just because it's also less forgiving in some respects and harder to pilot, I put them at a B. And I'm also keeping the Brotherhood at a B. They're strong, they're good, but when your leader is 6 threat, if he gets out of position, it can be really, really bad. Magneto himself is one of the characters that just has more mechanics on him than a typical character does with his constructs. Not overly complicated. If somebody wants to jump into the game and play Brotherhood, they can absolutely do it. Maybe takes a little bit of extra understanding just how Magneto works. And overall, the team is really strong. It has low threat characters to kind of help balance out the 6 threat side. But if you start bringing Juggernaut, Scarlet Witch, and Magneto, you're not you're not in a great spot. You're gonna if one of those characters goes down, the game plan kind of probably falls apart around them. So it's not extremely forgiving. You can go wider so that if a character gets out of position, it's not as bad of a day. But as a whole, I think B's a fair place to put them where you can pretty easily find success, but to get them to that next level, the higher tier play, there are extra inclusions during roster building that you can make sure to help round that out, like Lockjaw and other stuff. And then next up, we've got the Cabal. I'm going to throw them in A next to A Force. Uh, Overall, pretty simple leadership that is hard to forget. Sometimes you can forget. Oh, well, it happens. But you just generate extra power to do more stuff. And it's an affiliation that is very, you can just throw other characters that you like into there. And as long as you've got a few villains in there, you're probably affiliated anyway. Since leadership is a little bit more complicated, so that brings the ease of play, the expert level stuff down a little bit. But they're just not quite to the level of ease of play as what Sam Spam is able to achieve. So just a little bit lower than the Avengers, but not like terribly low or anything. Still very easy to plug and play, especially if you're feeling a little bit more villainous. Uh, and at the very bottom, I've got the Convocation. Uh, this is a team that has so many cool features and a lot of stuff going for them, but ease of play is not among them. All of their lowest defense on all of the Convocation characters is the most common attack type with physical. And so, like, sure, you've got some defensive abilities that help counter that out a little bit, looking at Ancient One, but not all of those characters have that extra kind of reinforced durability. There's tactic cards you have to worry about. Your leadership itself is a tactic card that then gets put on any of the members of Convocation. There are so many cool tricks that this team are able to do and pull out, but they are not beginner friendly because they do not play like a traditional affiliation. Uh, it's not very forgiving. It's really cool. They're really good, but they're not an easy to play affiliation. It's one of the few that I've only done one game with, and I just am barely beginning to fully understand what they're capable of myself, I feel like. Next up is one of the few affiliations that is like almost all about control, and that is going to be the Criminal Syndicate. I'm going to put them at C because just really the playstyle of control is something that's a little bit harder to fully understand and make sure you're making all of the right plays, because there's a lot more decision points in a control matchup. And Criminal Syndicate's control is baked into their leadership ability. So at this point, this is not taking into account Shadowlands Daredevil, mostly because we don't have the full rules of how grunts work. And I feel like that's at least a quarter of how Shadowlands Daredevil is going to play. And I've nobody's really got to test with them either at this point because we don't have the full rules for grunts. So at this point, disregarding that, just Kingpin, and it's a really strong. Again, probably one of the better affiliations out there at the moment. But their reliance on making sure they get a secure that they can benefit from instead of a control one is a big deal, and usually makes you want to have to probably go dual affiliated. That might just be a me thing, but who knows? Overall, the team is pretty forgiving with a lot of durable bodies that lean themselves toward wanting to stay healthy to benefit from the leadership. But if you're a player who's new to the game and you just kind of want to go in, you want to punch stuff, it's not necessarily the most intuitive team. Once you get to get an understanding, you can begin to just focus on making sure you have characters on the secure points. But at the same time, when your last activation is very important, you want to make sure you're understanding the entire game state, in my opinion. So I'm going to leave them down here at C. And then the other big bad leader with Dormammu in the Dark Dimension, I'm going to leave at B as well, I think, along with Thanos. And really, the primary thing is this is a affiliation that's pretty easy to play. You set them down, you go forth, you get power, you try to daze and kill your enemy team to the point where they just don't have characters left to control points. You can be very aggressive with Dormammu and what he's doing. Dormammu himself is very difficult to handle for your opponent. But if Dormammu gets out of position and are able to, he's just getting swapped by attacks. Dormammu can go down. He's pretty dice reliant on his defensive side. And so if enough characters just get enough attacks in and you lose your 8 threat leader, the game's in a really bad spot for the Dark Dimension player at that point. So he's not very forgiving, but he is pretty easy to pick up and kind of understand what the affiliation is wanting to do. So leaving him right in the middle. The defenders, I'm going to leave in B because they don't really have a defined play style at the moment. They used to be all about the turn one play with the portals, but that is no longer an option for the defenders, unfortunately. So they're kind of in this weird space until we get some tactic cards or another leader that are going to kind of help shape and define, because they have one of the widest affiliation rosters in the game that is a mix of control, some durability, some aggression. And so they're kind of this weird jack of all trades, but really master of none at the moment. So you can put them on the table. You can find success with them pretty easily. Throw a beam or two in there to take full advantage of Strange's leadership. But then outside of that, they're not anything that you're going to necessarily try to master at this point, in my opinion. So I guess the skill floor is pretty low as well. I don't know. I just feel like they belong at B right now because there's the mastery space is just so unknown. And for completely different reasons, I'm also going to throw the Guardians of the Galaxy in the B tier, mostly because you know what? I'm going to be bold. I'm going to throw them in A tier. A tier because they are an affiliation that is pretty forgiving just because the team goes really wide. They have 2 in affiliation 2 threats, a lot of it in affiliation 3 threats. So the team's able to go wide. Drax and Groot are both extremely durable. They've got some rerolls in the form of their leadership. All in all, a pretty good place to be. There aren't really any control elements to this team either. It is pretty aggressive all around. So it's pretty straightforward what you're trying to do. You're just going in, you're blasting, you're able to throw your tokens around where you see fit. There are some critical points of like, hey, do I save these rerolls for defense or attacks, or who gets these rerolls, who needs them? And their tactic cards don't really necessarily take too much strategy to orient. But when you have 2 characters that have to kind of stay beside each other for them to get the full value, it does put a little bit of a learning curve on the difficulty. So Rocket and Groot being the primary example there. Next up, I have another C tier, and that is the Inhumans. Inhumans are really good. They're even consistent, so they're actually pretty forgiving both on offense and defense, except for, I guess, Ronan, who doesn't have any natural rerolls, but he's not actually Inhuman. He's kind of, man, don't worry about that part. The thing that puts them a little bit harder to play is the leadership, actually. So if we look up at like Magneto, Red Skull, Avengers, A Force, all of these are power generating leadership abilities, or value at least, in the when it comes to Steve, that are gaining you value. The Inhumans don't actually gain you value; they just push their power around. And so, as long as you have a plan for what you're doing with that power, maybe characters that are specifically there to push power to other characters. So, like maybe a Vision who can easily accrue power, doesn't have a lot of ways to spend it himself, but make sure that you can get all of that onto Black Bolt or something like that for big attacks. But there does need to be a game plan when you're going in within humans, because they have to have something to do with that leadership. Puts them quite a bit up the difficulty curve as far as like even just beginners. Like you can push power around, but if you're just shuffling power for the sake of it, there's not really any value to you're getting out of those plays or anything like that. Next up, we have the Midnight Suns, a very aggressive affiliation. And I'm also going to put them up here at A because their game plan is a pretty straightforward one. It's all about the attacks. There are some decision points that you'll want to be keeping in mind, like when do you play Siege of Darkness? How many out of affiliation characters do you bring in? Because you're at that point then belittling the value you can get out of Siege of Darkness. They aren't super durable for the most part, Iron Fist kind of being a great example, but they have a lot of great just in affiliation characters. So putting them on the board and going aggressive with them is a pretty straightforward plan. The leadership can be one that is easily forgotten or not always necessarily fully optimized because it is a really good leadership. And because you can make some turn one plays happen with it, among other things, it's just below that ranking of S tier ease of play, but they're definitely easy to pick up. Go to town with them. Use Siege of Darkness. Throw in Mystique if you want a little bit of extra spice. All in all, though, a really good team. The only real knock I have to them is they're a little bit not great in the forgiveness category, just because there is some lacking of durability there, but otherwise, fantastic. Which then brings me to Green Goblin's Spider Foes, and I'm going to put them up here at S because everything about them is streamlined and pretty simple at this point. The leadership is one that, as long as you're remembering it, is going to do great. You make your opponent reroll on defense, extremely valuable, really annoying, as I've more often been on the receiving end of it. But the other thing that's really nice is there is a little bit of control characters that can throw, but all of these different control elements like Mysterio's Tricks and Traps, Doc Ock's throw, all of these things are also things that are dealing damage. So it's not really control for the sake of control like it is with maybe a team like the Web Warriors. It's control with a little bit of damage on the side, which is really mean and nasty. And even their tactic cards that deal with the crisis give them control, moving them away from secures or making them drop extracts while also dealing more damage. So I think the Spider Foes are the easiest to learn of the attrition focused affiliations out there. They go in, they kill stuff, and that's kind of just their whole shtick. Even the objective stuff that they have, like I've mentioned with tactic cards, is trying to kill them while also making them lose the points on objectives. So, all in all, a really straightforward affiliation that I don't think has too much complexity to it, and probably also a bit of a fan favorite, unless I'm going to skip ahead to them now. You're a fan of the Web Warriors when you're playing the other side of it. And the Web Warriors, because they, like Criminal Syndicate, are such a control focused affiliation, I don't think that they're necessarily the easiest to pick up and play. There's a good bit of complexity to how you want to play them, except for the characters that have defensive rerolls. They're not extremely forgiving. If Gwen gets out of position, for example, which is very easy for her to do with her long move and just skirting around the board, can get caught out and dazed very easily. But really, though, it's not so much that it's hard to pilot this team when you put it first on the board. It's one of the teams that has a very high ceiling for how well they can do, though. And it's mostly because of that I put them down here at C. And then rising just above them is another control affiliation, but it's also one that's a lot more consistent, and that is Wakanda. They both have rerolls in their leadership, but Wakanda, you have to pay for the power, but you also get to then use that reroll on offense. Uh, I think 4 out of the 5 affiliated characters have rerolls just on the card as well. Black Panther on offense and then has defensive tech. Killmonger on offense. Shuri gives rerolls on offense and defense to her friends. Okoye rerolls on defense. Wakanda Forever is a really strong tactic card. So they have a little bit of control in them with Shuri and Black Panther anyway. Just all in all, a really solid team that you can put on the board. The optimal play of them definitely brings them down from A to B, in my opinion, because the timing of your pushes, the timing of when you play Wakanda Forever, and how many points that card alone can get your team need to be used very well. And that's not always the easiest thing to do. But as a whole, they're pretty forgiving because they have that consistency built in there. There's not necessarily a super in-depth game plan that you need like the Inhumans do. Just be able to control the secure points a little bit better than most other teams and are forgiving. It's a nice combination for somebody who wants to pick up the game and kind of learn. Which leaves us with the 2X teams, X Factor and X Men. And at this point, I am going to be including today's releases in my thought process here, and that is X-23, Honey Badger, Colossus, etc. So I think as far as ease of play, the X Force are pretty straightforward. They're similar to Spider Foes with just not as necessarily with more decision points. Because there are times with Domino where it could be better to incinerate somebody, it could be better to use her rapid fire pistols, depending on what the rest of the board state looks like. They don't have as many, just really, they don't have any control elements on other characters and affiliation that come to mind, like the Spider Foes do. So controlling the points is a little bit more difficult than it is. But Spider Foes and X Force are very comparable to one another. The game plan is straightforward. You're going for those dazes and KOs, and they have good tools to get there. Extra turn one attacks because of the X Force leap ahead that I don't remember the name of at the moment. The incinerates to just whittle down your opponent's defenses even more. Overall, pretty straightforward. The X-Men, on the other hand, I'm going to leave it be. They did just get some great new resources in the form of Rogue, Gambit, Magic. The list kind of gets to go on. These are all characters that are going to shine. X-23 and Honey Badger, just all good things helping round out this affiliation with like everything from a 2-threat in affiliation. X-Force has all these things too. But the X-Men are still a little bit more complex in what they're trying to accomplish. They have the issue with Cyclops' leadership that the Inhumans have, where there's not really a value engine that happens, but rather it's a power shuffling. When characters are using the spender, they can borrow power basically from their allies, but they have to be within range 3. So you kind of have to have a game plan built around that. Who are going to be the characters building up the power? Who are the characters who are going to be spending it, and so on. Storm, you also want to take into account things like, hey, I want to make sure that I have characters that can attack from outside of range 2 so that then they attack back. I get the benefit of cover that Storm's leadership provides, as well being able to optimize the base placement or leapfrog effect that Storm's other part of her leadership provides, being able able to optimize that with a bigger bases at the right times, just more decision points, make it a little bit harder to pilot this team to, in quotes, air quotes at least, perfection is going to be a little bit harder than it would be with like X Force. But as a whole, you can absolutely just throw down your team of 90s nostalgia and begin to find some synergies within a couple games, I think. So this is my final tier list for ease of play for the 18 affiliations we currently have in Marvel Crisis Protocol. Let me know down in the comments what you think. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, keep on gaming.